Big day for the Carolina Panthers as they introduce Dave Canales as head coach, and we hear from Dan Morgan, now president of football operations and general manager. Joining us to talk about it, Locked On Panthers host Julian Council. Julian, I know you're not, and I'm not a big win the press conference guy, but I kind of thought Canales and Morgan doubled up the press conference and pitched a shutout. We'll start with Canales. Your biggest takeaway from his comments?
Yeah, we're still learning a lot about who Dave Canales is, and we heard so much about him being a great communicator. David Tepper said that both him and Dan Morgan are great connectors within the building and their roles that they're stepping in here in Carolina. And you can tell that Dave Canales is someone who spent over a decade plus with Pete Carroll out in Seattle, as he has that effervescent personality. He has the positivity that is exuded in Seattle for over 10 plus years, as that organization has continuously been a playoff team that's been to multiple Super Bowls, having won one. And you could feel with Dave Canales that he's going to bring that kind of energy to Carolina. I love how he talked about he wants this to be a place where players can thrive, saying it's not about him, it's not about the coaches, it's about the players, the players, the players. That's what really stood out to me when it came to Dave Canales. And that he also said that he was ready for this opportunity. He was only an OC for 1 year as a primary play caller, having been passed over multiple times in Seattle. And he said that for him, his wife, their entire family, that this was the right opportunity for them to come here. Never mind the fact that there's been coaches fired seemingly every single year over the last couple of years. Dave Canales is focused on competing in Carolina, being a part of this community, and connecting with his players and getting them to perform at the highest level moving forward.
Julian, there was a moment in Dan Morgan's comments where I actually think I went back in time and saw Dan Morgan, the linebacker. His eyes were wide when he was talking about the types of players he wants. What did you take away from Morgan's comments today?
Well, Dan Morgan was in the locker room before that wild card game during the 2003 season, 2004 playoffs against the Dallas Cowboys on that Saturday night in Charlotte when Sam Mills gave him that keep pounding speech. He understands what keep pounding means. He understands what this city is like when this Panther team is good. And you saw him point out during that press conference, the Thomas Davises, the Luke Kuechlys, Muhsin Muhammad's, all the Panther greats, Jonathan Stewart, that are sitting there in the crowd at Bank of America Stadium on Thursday morning. He understands what a Panther player has in their heart, in their minds, and in their soul, what it takes to compete and win in the NFL, but especially here in Charlotte. And having someone who understands this team's history, I think, is important. You saw back in 2022 when Steve Wilkes was able to turn things around, had the Panthers right there on the cusp of winning the NFC South and going to the playoffs. He talked about bringing pride back to Carolina, that protecting the bank, understanding what it takes to win, showing his players some of those videos of when he was here under Ron Rivera, when they were winning the division 3 straight years, when they were going to the playoffs, when they had Cam Newton, Luke Kuechly, Thomas Davis, Jonathan Stewart, when they were having success, Greg Olsen. He understood it, and it was unfortunate to not see Steve Wilkes get the job last year. But now David Tepper, it seems like he's understood maybe the errors in his ways as he's going with someone who has the background and is certainly capable and having earned this position to be the president of football operations and general manager in Dan Morgan. But he's also someone who understands what winning looks like in Charlotte and how much this team means to the city, means to this community, and especially means to him. So just that passion and understanding of the history, I think that's important. I think that's going to be what potentially helps Dan Morgan build a winner here in Carolina on the personnel side.
Julian, it seemed like Dave Canales really had 2 selling points to become the head coach. Obviously, his work with Bryce Young and what he would do there, and we'll get to that. But the other one was culture. Now, we know he's been around winning culture. He hasn't had a chance to implement it as a head coach except for the Carson High School JV squad. Are you confident that he can do it here with a team that really needs it?
I think it's possible. Pete Carroll has been somebody that I've admired my entire life as being a football fan, dating back to his time at USC and seeing what he's done in Seattle. And as Panther fans know, the Panthers and the Seahawks had some pretty tight battles there in the late 2010s, back when Cam Newton was here, Luke Kuechly, Thomas Davis, all those players that I mentioned before that were mentioned also by Dan Morgan in the press conference on Thursday morning. They saw the culture in Seattle, and dating back to his time at USC, Pete Carroll's always been about positivity, but he's also always been about competition. And bringing in some competition is something the Carolina Panthers desperately need to get the best out of their players. There's guys like Brian Burns, if he stays, that you're not concerned about his production. Derek Brown, certainly not concerned about him. Taylor Moton. But across the roster, there isn't that kind of depth and talent that you need to win at a high level in the NFC South, but in the NFL. So I think as far as culture-wise, understanding that they need some positivity to get guys like Bryce Young coming off of a tough rookie season to feel good about himself and believe in himself. They also need positivity opportunity for a bunch of guys who have been here, like Brian Burns, who have never won anything so far in the NFL. But they also need to bring in some competition to push some of the better players and some of the guys who maybe haven't lived up to expectations so far to the next level and get this team to be a winning program moving forward. So that's some of the things I'm looking to see out of Dave Canales as he builds his culture in Carolina.
Okay, on the Dave Canales and Bryce Young dynamic, because that's crucial for any of this working.
Yes.
When Dave Canales was asked what attracted him to the Carolina job, unsolicited, he went on basically a 4-minute soliloquy about how much he loves Bryce Young. What did you make of that?
I'm not surprised, honestly. When I looked at this job, I could see Bryce Young being a positive and a negative as far as the candidates looking at this job. Now, if you felt like what Bryce Young did this past season is indicative of who he's going to be, that would be a negative. But if you looked at Bryce Young, you saw some of the errors that he had last year, but also looked at the Packers game, where he was outstanding, especially in that second half. You look at the comeback win against the Houston Texans, the last-minute drive against the Falcons in the rain, and some of the other moments that he had. You saw the glimpses of who Bryce Young was coming out of Alabama. We're less than a year removed from plenty of people across the league believing that he was the number one quarterback. Of course, there was debate between him and C.J. Stroud, and we know what C.J. Stroud was able to do down there in Houston, different circumstance. You wonder how things may have been different had Young been there and Stroud would have been here in Carolina, but we'll never know. But as far as Bryce Young goes, Dave Canales pointed out, too, that he went back to look at the notes that he had on him pre-draft. And if he believed in Bryce Young pre-draft, after one tough season where there's been sweeping changes on the coaching staff and general manager side of things in Carolina, I wouldn't think that a coach would want to quit on Bryce Young. I would think that he'd want to come here to work with him and get him to play at the level that they expect him to play at coming out of Alabama. So hearing him say that was not surprising at all, because I didn't think anyone was going to take this job, knowing how ownership felt about Bryce Young, how Dan Morgan felt about Bryce Young and that entire scouting staff, that they were going to have to be 100% on board with him. And Dave Canales certainly proved on Thursday morning that he absolutely is ready to work with Bryce Young and get him to play at the level that we saw to Geno Smith and Baker Mayfield the past 2 seasons in Seattle and Tampa Bay, respectively.
All right, Dave Canales has taken 2 giant leaps in his career the last 2 years, from just longtime positional coach to offensive coordinator with the Bucs last year, now a head coach in the NFL. Do you have any concerns about Dave Canales entering his 2nd season as an NFL play caller while also putting on top of that first-year NFL head coach?
I appreciate his self-awareness. He did come out and say, is it crazy if I say I'm a little nervous? He understands how intense this is to come take over one of the 32 jobs in the NFL as a head coach. He understands the circumstances in which he's stepping into here in Carolina. But he's also someone who pointed out that he's 42 years old. He's got his wife. He's got his 4 kids. Like, it's time for him to go out there and to lead a team, and that he has been building towards this for a long time. And having worked under Pete Carroll, and what really stood out to me was when Pete Carroll told him to think about the next thing, told him to open his eyes to think about not just the quarterbacks, but the wide receivers, the linebackers, the corners, understand the entirety of the roster and what their needs need to be. That makes me think that, okay, this guy is maybe ready to step into one of these situations. You also look at Tampa Bay. It's not like that was the most attractive job as far as an OC job going into last season with Tom Brady retiring, bringing in Baker Mayfield, who had a rough season here in Carolina before going on to play with the Rams. Canales took on that challenge, and he thrived. The offensive numbers may not have been the best in the league, but as far as what he was able to do with Mayfield as a quarterback position, and then looking at that team get hot in the last half of the season and go to the playoffs, win a game, push Detroit, it's going to be still a work in progress as far as play calling. He's only had 1 year of experience at any level as a play caller. Naturally, with more reps, more time, he will get better at it, I would believe. Geno Smith said so many great things about him. Baker Mayfield, I don't think he said anything yet, but I'm sure he would say glowing things. And, of course, Pete Carroll has said glowing things about Dave Canales. I'm not totally concerned about that. It's one of the unfortunate things about the hiring cycle is that with offensive coaches being so coveted, they don't oftentimes get a lot of time to be an OC and to be able to grow into that position before becoming a head coach. But Dave Canales, he's going to be learning on the job. And I think that David Tepper, hopefully, will be patient enough to give him some time as he grows into it and leads his team moving forward.
Let's talk about Ejiro Evero, because I think when you just look at what Dave Canales said on paper or on Twitter or X, yeah, he's coming back. Hearing him say it sounds like he wants him to be here as defensive coordinator, but it didn't seem like it was a done deal. What did you take from that, and how important or unimportant is it that Evero returns as defensive coordinator?
Well, it's certainly important. Dave Canales came out and said that he's a huge piece of what they want to do, and it would be nice to have some sort of continuity here in Carolina, especially on the defensive side of the ball, and understanding didn't have Shaq Thompson for the final 15 games of the season, missed J.C. Horn for the majority of the season, had times where they didn't have Brian Burns for a game. They didn't have Xavier Woods and Von Bell, the two starting safeties, for a couple games. Had to have some players like Troy Hill step up, Alex Cook step up, Sam Franklin had to step up, and yet that defense still was able to be competitive for the most part, especially post-bye week for the Carolina Panthers, to be able to bring him back and his staff and have that kind of continuity and be able to build with a defense that hopefully in 2024 for the Carolina Panthers sake will actually be healthy. You could imagine that could reasonably be a top 10 unit across multiple categories, especially in the red zone where they struggled this past year, and in scoring defense and turnovers as well. And it's interesting too, because Dave Canales didn't flat out say that he would be back, and the audio was kind of choppy when I was watching it virtually. I couldn't tell what Joe Person of The Athletic was asking as a follow-up, and whether he was specifically asking him, is he coming back? And then what Dave Canales' real answer was there, because there was a yes, but what was the question before that? I was look at the reports. You look at Green Bay, an option that you would have thought would have made a lot of sense for Ejiro Evero. They went out there and hired Jeff Hafley from Boston College to be their DC. The Rams reportedly are going to be elevating one of their staff members to the defensive coordinator role. That was another spot you would have thought Ejiro Evero was going to go, knowing that he's been blocked from multiple interviews, and that two spots that would have made a ton of sense for him, especially to be competitive next year, are gone. It looks like he's probably going to be back for the Carolina Panthers, and that absolutely is a great thing for Dave Canales and for this Panthers team as they head into the 2024 offseason.
Julian, Dan Morgan was obviously, and for good reason, tied with the moves that Scott Fitterer made. He was his right-hand man. But I thought it was interesting when Dan Morgan was talking about the types of players that he wants in Carolina, clearly a signal that he doesn't have them yet. So I guess what's your confidence level that Dan Morgan can get those players and his talent evaluation? And is that kind of I know they're best friends, but like a little bit of a separating line between what Fitterer wanted and what Morgan wants?
It's hard to say my confidence level because I just don't know. I would just put it at a 5 out of 10, right in the middle. I could see it being a disaster considering the fact that since he's been here, well, it's been a disaster personnel-wise. In the last couple seasons, he's been heading up the scouting department, and they have done a pretty bad job scouting, as is evidenced with the 2-15 season that the Carolina Panthers just had this past fall. But also, I don't know necessarily who's making all those decisions. The Carolina Panthers talked a lot about alignment today at the press conference, but they've also talked about in the past about everyone collaborating. So how many moves are really on Scott Fitterer? How many of the moves were on Matt Rule when he was here? How many of the moves were on Frank Reich and some of the other coaches who may have wanted certain players that are now those coaches are no longer here? How much of that really was on Dan Morgan and the scouting department? How much of it was on some of the previous people who are no longer here in Carolina? I'm willing to sit here and just give him a clean slate. And that's, I believe, what's absolutely happening right now. They're going to tie him to Dave Canales, to Bryce Young, and then move forward, all aligned with the same vision, which is to get some dogs in here, bring back some pride to Carolina to be able to win, get Bryce Young to play at a high level. I think Dan Morgan, I believe he can do it, I suppose. It's hard to say yes or no whether I do believe it or not. It's one of those things where you just got to go out there and see it. And the same thing with Dave Canales. While you've seen what he's been able to do with Baker and Geno Smith, he hasn't been leading a team. And he seems to be a great communicator, and he has the personality and the positivity that you would want in a head coach. But when it gets to game day, can he actually do it between the lines? Can he make the right decisions on third down? Can he be competitive and get the team to play the way that they need to play? Can he actually build that culture? Those are all unknowns. Those are things that you would like to believe coming out of a press conference, but those are questions that won't be answered until, well, they finally get an opportunity to do that. So the hope is that Dan Morgan can do that. David Tepper believes he can attack it like he did as a linebacker in the NFL, but it still remains to be seen whether that will be the case.
All right, there was an interesting guest in the front row. That was Brandt Tillis, newly named Executive Vice President of Football Operations, going to handle contract negotiations while Morgan does more of the personnel stuff. What do you think of the way this front office has been restructured?
Quite honestly, I feel like Brandt Tillis may be the most important person currently standing, as the Carolina Panthers have to figure out the deals with Brian Burns. Are they going to franchise tag him? Are they going to be able to extend him prior to the new league's year starting? Are they going to be able to extend Frankie Louvu, re-sign him to a deal? What are they going to do with Derek Brown? What's the decision that's going to be made with J.C. Horn? I assume probably they're not going to exercise his fifth-year option. I think that he's probably the most important man right now as we're sitting here in February. Dave Canales, he's going to put together a staff. He's going to have, of course, Brandt Tillis help him out with some of those contracts, but his work doesn't really start until about May when he's out there during OTAs working with the team. And then, of course, once they get down to training camp, and Dan Morgan, he'll be important as they're scouting and evaluating players throughout the rest of the coming weeks with the scouting combine going on and with the draft lead up and all that. But looking at Brandt Tillis, he's been in Kansas City and he's been able to help them build a team that's going back to the Super Bowl. A Kansas City Chiefs team where a lot of people question trading Tyreek Hill. Didn't matter. Won a Super Bowl last year. They struggled at wide receiver this year. Doesn't matter. They're going back to the Super Bowl again to be able to make some great deals with Pat Mahomes, Chris Jones, being able to build a team that can still win, especially defensively, what they've been able to do this past season. You have to be encouraged by someone who's been a part of winning organization and someone who has experience in negotiating a big-time quarterback contract, which you hope in a couple of years' time you'll be negotiating with Bryce Young. So I do like the power structure here in Carolina. I'm so interested to see how involved David Tepper will be, and they're going to have daily conversations. As they said, he's not just going to disappear. So it's good to know that he has somewhat of experience from a winning organization like Tillis, that Dan Morgan, Dave Canales, that those two are on the same page. We'll find out in due time how much of an impact the owner will still have here in Carolina.
Julian, you like a Bryce Young anticipatory throw. You just led me right into my last question. Joe Person of The Athletic chased down David Tepper at the end of the press conference and tried to get him to talk, and Tepper said, nope, I'm in the background now. Do you believe that?
No, I do not believe it. Also, and here's the thing. Anytime David Tepper does talk, the last couple of years, he doesn't really answer the questions. We still don't know why he fired Frank Reich. We still don't know why he fired Matt Rule. Now, in our hearts, in minds, we absolutely know why it happened, but he never explicitly told us why it happened. So we'll find out whether David Tepper really is going to be hands off, but it's hard to believe considering the history of him being very hands-on in Carolina. So just take a deep breath, everybody, and things will be okay, maybe.
Well, whether or not David Tepper has weekly meetings with his new head coach, we know that Julian Council's got you covered every week on Locked On Panthers. Thank you, buddy.
Absolutely.